All right, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Kevin Murphy with the Office of Water Programs here at Sac State, and we're happy you are attending our first of two Spring 2024 Water Seminar Series presentations. As most of you know, we are a training and research organization with a focus on water quality and water resources, and we annually host two fall presentations and two spring presentations. So following suit, we'll have one more presentation this spring where the Army Corps and Sac County will talk about the huge bank protection project on the American River, just adjacent to the Sac State campus. I also want to point out that all the presentations we host are recorded and can be accessed via the Office of Water Programs website. So today's presentation will be approximately 45 minutes long, so we should have about 15 minutes left for questions at the end. We will go beyond 1 p.m. to answer questions if necessary. Please submit questions by emailing them to the email address currently showing on the screen, which is seminarquestions@owp.csus.edu. You can take a screenshot or also check the chat line where the email address is also provided. All right, for the important part. For the first time since this series got started back in 2015, our presenters, Maureen, Kerner, and Brian Currier, are actually from right here at OWP. And they are going to talk about safe drinking water for disadvantaged communities. Maureen is a research engineer here at OWP. She also serves as the Associate Director of the Environmental Finance Center at Sac State for EPA Region 9. She has a bachelor's degree in civil and environmental engineering from University of Wisconsin at Madison and a master's degree in environmental engineering from Oregon State. She's also a registered civil engineer in California. Her work supports communities, tribes, and federal and state agencies in developing technical, managerial, financial, and equitable capacity building for drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater programs. Brian Currier is also a research engineer here at OWP. He holds bachelor's and master's degrees in civil and environmental engineering from UC Davis. He is also a registered professional engineer in California. His work focuses on safe drinking water for disadvantaged communities, stormwater management effectiveness evaluation, funding stormwater programs, source control and elimination, workforce development, stormwater capture optimization, drinking water quality, and small wastewater systems. And with that, I will hand it off to Maureen.
Thank you, Kevin. Just pulling my screen up. Give me a second. And I assume you can hear me?
Yes.
Great. Get into slide mode. Okay, everything look okay, Kevin? You can see my screen? Cool. All right. Well, hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Sunny day here in Sacramento, right outside my window and behind me. We're focused today on what's going on with drinking water needs in California, and particularly a lot of the work that the state legislature, the California State Water Board, have been doing to address the needs, and particularly for disadvantaged or otherwise underserved communities. And then we'll also talk about how OWP has been involved to support all of this. So again, I'll do we'll talk a little bit about the community needs and perspective in California. Again, those state programs and initiatives and how OWP fits in. So we've all probably heard it. There's all kinds of different headlines all over for a long time, too long time now. About 1 million California residents live in areas underserved by water systems that are failing to supply clean drinking water. And you can throw your own adjective in. Sad, horrible. I think everybody would agree that it's unacceptable. And in fact, if you would Google California safe drinking water, you might get a lot of really just kind of disturbing images. I'm going to pause a sec so I can change something here. Whoops. Okay. And so so you can get a lot of just these disturbing images. And it's just a huge extent, and that'll look just kind of seems bleak. You know, as our resident lead, Randy Marks, for technical assistance, what we do here at OWP, particular in California, is that too many communities have poor drinking water. So today we're going to be really focusing on what are people doing about it. There's a lot of efforts, like I mentioned, state water board, legislatures, TA providers, all kinds of environmental justice practitioners, all kinds of individual community champions. The state has passed legislation to address the needs, and you know, a lot of people are leading the way in developing and implementing programs and projects to meet the various needs. So one particular effort is the State Water Board's annual drinking water needs assessment, and that kind of sets up definitions for systems that are failing and at risk. They look at various factors associated with water quality, such as exceedance of maximum contaminant levels for drinking water. There's accessibility factors, such as the number of drinking water sources, whether it be wells or tapping into a local water body. There's excessive, and then if communities are relying on bottled water, that would be an accessibility issue. Affordability factor could be just, you know, the medium household incomes. And then there's all these different factors associated with, we call it technical, managerial, and financial capacity. That would be operator certification violations, monitoring and reporting violations. And then there's all these financial metrics like days cash on hand, and that they're looking at. And if you look at these numbers in the chart above, this is from the Water Board's website. So they're tracking this. And I think that's kind of the message. Again, there's a lot of stuff that's going on. As horrible as these as these occurrences are, there's a lot of movement forward to improve. So let's back up. This started many, many years ago, this, you know, support to make things better. It started with the Human Right to Water Assembly Bill 685, and that Governor Brown signed in 2012. And it was actually made California the first state in the nation to legislatively recognize the human right to water. And then in 2016, this California State Water Resources Control Board came in with a resolution adopting the human right to water, and they recognize that every human being has the right to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible water. And that water right extends to all individuals, including disadvantaged communities and groups in urban and rural areas. So since then, the Water Board has put together all kinds of programs and initiatives. These are the ones in particular that we'll be talking about today. Most of these efforts fall under a big one that's been recent. It's the Safe and Affordable Funding for Equity and Resilience. They call it the Safer Drinking Water Program. And that program was started by Senate Bill 200 in 2019. And I gotta change something here, just a minute. I've got something in the way. Okay, so it was passed in 2019, and it was really to help support that human right to water. So it established kind of a set of different resources for helping particularly small and disadvantaged communities. And that program has now been going on really well with a lot of success. As of 2023, 185 more systems providing safe and affordable drinking water, representing over 1 million Californians. And there have been, since before the SAFER program started, a 95% increase in grant funding that goes to disadvantaged communities. And there have been 94 consolidations that serve greater than 50,000 people. In case you don't know what I mean when I say consolidation, it's essentially when a small water system or group of systems will work with an existing system that's well established and has good service, and they do a physical tie-in to that service, so the old service disbands. And so with that, there's a lot better resilience for those communities. A word about the term disadvantaged communities. So there's all kinds of different definitions, and I think several years ago, the term was set up as it relates to funding, and it kind of focused on a 80% medium household income. And when you look at the California State revolving fund, which is funding that from EPA, and there's a match from the state that gives money in form of grants and loans to water systems. They have an SRF definition that goes to this 80% MHI. Most states have adopted this. But when we talk about disadvantaged communities, there's other more looser definitions as well. Sometimes they might just be rural or socially vulnerable. There's CalEnviroscreen that has a number of different metrics with criteria to kind of rate different communities with respect to being disadvantaged. So when we talk about disadvantaged communities today, we're kind of talking about all of these things together, and maybe a better term maybe is underserved, because it doesn't necessarily have a specific definition to it. Let's see. So let's start talking a little bit about what OWP has been doing. So on the right, we have a map of the communities that we've been helping throughout the state, and it branches all the way from Southern California at the Mexican border to Northern California through Chico. And so a really good kind of representation. And Brian will tell you probably more about the numbers in a little bit. That I think an important piece to mention here is that not only have we been doing work in California, but because of our work in California, we have gotten national recognition. And EPA has actually reached out to us and asked us to start helping disadvantaged and other communities in the Western states, as well as even in the Midwest. And so here's on the left a little bit of a map, so you can see kind of how far our reach has gone. And we've done different type of either directly working with communities, or we were kind of this funding pass-through group that hired other TA providers and oversaw their activities helping these other communities. So it's really been going a long way. A note about going back to kind of that human right to water, and what, again, we really wanted to kind of impress on folks today is the communities that are getting help. And I think that human right to water really nicely fits in and aligns with OWP's mission. So cost-effective solutions for protecting and enhancing water resources and public health just very, very much support the right to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible water. And then furthermore, when we talk about the services that we're providing, it really represents Sacramento State as an anchor university. And what does that mean? Sacramento State as an anchor university really tries to cultivate partnerships, confront systemic inequalities. We want to transform the lives of students and then strengthen communities. So as we talk about our services today, listen for ways that we're doing that. I think we really, again, fit in with that anchor university theme. Okay, so let's really talk a little bit more about our services. And we'll start with some of the direct technical assistance that we're doing. This is funded for communities, again, throughout California through the State Water Board's Safer Drinking Water Program. And it's also funded by the 2014 Proposition 1 Water Bond Fund. So technical assistance funding program, again, Water Board. It's intended to help small communities or disadvantaged communities with out-of-compliance water systems. The goal is really to get better water systems, improved water systems that are compliant and safe, accessible, et cetera, for drinking water. There's also funding for wastewater systems to get those projects in the ground. Our focus as a TA provider is really to complete construction funding applications. And so we do this in a whole different set of ways. There's 4 different packages that are standard from the State Water Board for their funding programs. There's a general package, there's a technical package, which would be engineering and design plans. There's an environmental package that essentially follows all the CEQA documentation. There's a financial package that would be that technical, managerial, and financial capacity. Just checking how all these different pieces for a community and a water system are doing, and what specifically they need, what their plan is to move forward and address their issues. There's a lot of other types of TA providers and that we can hire out to do. But we don't necessarily do it ourselves. There's rate studies, there's income surveys, leak detections, and there's even legal assistance like land acquisition or consolidation agreements that folks like University of California, Davis do. So how do we go about providing this assistance? Well, it really starts at the State Water Board, and they have a standard form on their website, and they've been doing a lot of work trying to market and let people know it's available. It's a simple 1 to 2 page form that gets filled out saying, here's the community in need. This is generally why we need help. And they submit it, and Water Board reviews it. And then they have several, I think a dozen or so TA providers that have grants from the Water Board. And the Water Board assigns one of these TA providers, such as OWP, the TA request. And from there, OWP has a really great kind of model that we implement. And that, again, was started by OWP's Randy Marks, who's, again, the lead for our SAFER and Prop 1 funding technical assistance program. So once we have that, Randy identifies a project management manager from OWP, and we assemble a team. So that'll be folks from the state's Division of Financial Assistance, Division of Drinking Water, Division of and the SAFER program. And then also, obviously, we have some kind of champion representative of the community or the water system itself. And we start talking about what the needs are. We then draft a work plan. It's a pretty simple document that's maybe 8 pages or so. It gives just a couple narratives of what the issue is, where the community is located, and then just a nice simple table of the tasks that have to be done. Develop an environmental package, do a feasibility assessment, develop plans and specs. And then we go out and we find engineers to do the engineering piece of it. OWP in the past has been doing the financial packages for TMF assessment, capacity assessments. Once we have kind of selected a subcontractor, we'll go through with the Water Board and start doing execution phase for getting signatures on the work plans and the subcontracts, all that paperwork in place. And then once that comes through, we get to actually start implementing the work plan. We do monthly meetings, and that, I think, is the key to this model of TA. It really helps keep everybody in track. Some of our calls have 20 to 30 people involved. And it really, OWP serves as a big facilitator, coming in and saying, okay, what are the action items? What's the decision here? Let's keep moving forward. We're also almost like kind of on call for all these different team members, particularly the community, who sometimes is, just doesn't have as much understanding of the process and that, or needs help with gathering paperwork, or not sure what to do. So we get a lot of phone calls and kind of that hand holding to just kind of keep things moving forward. And again, kind of this whole program that Randy started really launched OWP into the national spotlight for other EPA assistance outside of California. So let me tell you a little bit about some of our systems. This is a community. One of them is Patterson Tract and Sunrise. They're consolidating with Cal Water Visalia. They're located in Tulare County. They have a medium household income of about $42,000. They have an existing well, and two tanks, and they've got asbestos cement water pipe, and it was constructed in the 1960s. So the Division of Drinking Water requested that we come in and help look at consolidation with California Water Service Visalia. While we were looking at that, we identified that Sunrise Mutual Water Company was located actually right between Patterson and Cal Water Visalia services. And so, well, as long as we're at it, let's go see if these guys are interested. And sure enough, their system is older, dependent on groundwater wells. Their system is aging, and they were real excited to be part of this effort. So we've been doing our monthly meetings. We have an engineer on board. We're putting together the design plan, specs, environmental CEQA compliance, financial packages, and that. A word again about the champions that the community representatives really are. A lot of times the community representatives or water system representatives are volunteers for their community. So they've got their own, job that they're doing, their family and friend lives that they're managing. And so a couple ways that we've come in is every week or every month when we have a phone call, the gal Linda, who represents Patterson, I send her a text to remind her that we've got a meeting coming up. And then, sometimes she can't make all the meetings, so I'll check in with her to make sure she knows what's going on. Sometimes with folks, we're all into decision-making mode. And during one call, we started talking about, well, Patterson can be the lead on this application. They can do this and this and this. And Linda wasn't there. And so I stepped in and had to say, well, okay, let's check with Linda, make sure that we can do this and that. So really kind of helping the whole group move forward, but also making sure that the community themselves, the folks in the community, are being well served. Here's another project. This is an elementary school in Yosemite Unified School District. They have 3 wells and a couple of storage tanks. One was disconnected due to high nitrate levels, and then they found another well had arsenic in it. They are with running. They took the one well with nitrate offline, but then we're really running short as far as enough water supply for the school based on just those two remaining wells, and that hit the fact that arsenic was in the other well really kind of ran things down. And so we're looking at we looked at consolidation. There's no system really within the area to do that. So we're looking at different wellhead treatments for the school. And finally, here's another example. This is a YMCA camp in the East Bay. Again, groundwater wells, a pretty remote location, no opportunity to consolidate. And so they have disinfection byproduct problems. So we are working at doing some kind of wellhead treatment for them. They have 200 and some students visiting weekly, or campers visiting weekly, and they have about 20 seasonal employees, and then there's maybe about 10 or so employees that are there full time. So there's kind of a small need, smaller example of a smaller community, but still, how do you get that service to them that's affordable and easier to operate, and still meets water quality compliance? Okay, so the one other project or program I'm going to talk about and then pass it on to Brian is the drinking water needs assessment. Again, California State Water Board program. This is done annually. The first one was done in 2019, and it's really used to inform the SAFER program. There are 4 components to it. They go ahead and they have this whole methodology, as I mentioned before, about identifying failing water systems, and they call that the human right to water list. So if there's some kind of water quality, maximum contaminant level exceedances, or other metrics, that system will go on a list, and the water board starts trying to get them assistance right away to resolve their issues. Whether it be new infrastructure planning, or maybe there's just some kind of technical technical short-term solution, or maybe it's just getting hauled bottled water hauled to them in the first place. There's a risk assessment in addition to that failing water system risk. There's, maybe not failing, but you're at risk of failing or potentially at risk. They also do a cost assessment, which really informs. So based on all these issues that the state is seeing with the different systems, they identify potential solutions for those, and then a really high level modeled cost to inform kind of the funding program and where the funding is going and those priorities. There is also an affordability assessment. What we see a lot is that, as much as you can even give folks a new water system, it's very difficult for them to be able to pay the rates that just to maintain it. So in this little more detail on how it works, there's the system risks and the resulting needs. They identify potential solutions. Costs are modeled. There is an assessment to look at if for these solutions that we're looking at, how sustainable and resilient is it? And then that solution is modeled, and all the individual systems are brought in together. Again, there's that affordability piece. And then finally, informs the funding solutions, the SAFER program. This particular drinking water needs assessment that was in 2019, OWP was on the initial group that did it. We were focused on the sustainability and resilience assessment. We also pulled together some data for the cost modeling. And right now we're actually doing a similar effort called the wastewater needs assessment. And I think from there, Brian, you're up.
All right. Thank you, Maureen. Can you hear me? Great.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to talk about two projects. Very excited to bring both of these to you all. The first one is lead, and then I'll talk about PFAS in a minute. I like to talk about lead and just reflect on my 21 years at OWP. This is by far my favorite project. So I'll tell you a little bit about the OWP role here with this project and what we're doing. Just a little bit of background. There we go, Maureen. We're on the right side. Yeah, just a little background is there is a requirement in statute AB 2370 that requires licensed child care centers to test all outlets in a facility that are used for food preparation or drinking water, and to test them for a lead concentration. And different from our federal levels, the child care centers are held to essentially a bottled water standard. So it's if it's 5.5 micrograms per liter or greater, or parts per billion, then it is considered an exceedance. So that's the testing requirement and the testing standard. There is thankfully some funding involved, and first via our state water board, we received a grant, and then through California Department of Social Services, we also have some EPA funding through that state agency. So the requirement applies to all licensed child care centers, and there's probably over 10,000 of those in the state. I have to roughly estimate because they come and go. And our role is to provide outreach services to them, to let them know funding's available. We handle all the documentation for those that are served by the grant team that they need to submit for compliance. We subcontract directly to samplers, so it's not a reimbursement program for sampling. We provide the sampler that shows up at their doorstep and collects the samples, and we also handle all the reporting. So that's the OWP role in that. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the staff involved. It is I think we're up to 30 full-time staff that have contributed to this project, and it just hits all elements of office of water programs. Our web development team and interns, our graphic design team and interns, our technical editor and intern, and our engineering research staff, environmental studies. In fact, there's so much intern support. We counted up so far on this project, I'm looking at my notes, 19 student assistants contributing to this project. And I just wanted to read you some of the majors that we pull from: environmental studies, public health, which is perfect. They've been helping with the outreach. So, and then communication studies, civil engineering, of course, and then computer science in a big, big way. In fact, our website, which is publicly facing and you can experience, is designed and kept largely by our computer science interns. So this, like every project at OWP, has just an army of students working in the background. Oh, I should also say IT support too, just to make sure computers and software are running as needed, and that's also largely done by our interns. All right, next slide, Maureen. Thanks. So I'm going to offer two views, and it's just a zoom in of a particular section of California. We're going to look at the map twice, once for lead, and then we'll talk about PFAS in a minute. Really happy to report that within, I would say, a conservative definition, not the broader definition Maureen was talking about, but a narrow definition of disadvantaged communities, we are serving or have served already 546 childcare centers in the state and counting. We have funding going into next calendar year to continue to serve childcare centers. By our best estimate, we're hoping that any childcare center out there that has not yet tested, we have the funding to provide the testing. Couldn't say that early on. A lot of them did have to provide their own sampling, but that is where we're at moving forward. So a big, big part of our emphasis now is outreach to those untested facilities around the state. Our partner on this is California Rural Water Association, and they're the samplers that we are that are showing up to pull those samples. Let's see. So there's a few other things I wanted to point out about this program that makes it so exciting and the best ever, at least in my career. And we have a mantra for this program. We say a tested facility is a safe facility. And that's because the way that CDSS and has regulated this program and coming out of this statute, it requires that any outlet that tests above the standard is immediately taken out of service. And so as those results come in, we're taking it out of service, and alternative water sources are identified. There can be, and usually are, other outlets at that facility that are fine and working. It turns out that the lead is largely coming from the fixture itself, which is interesting. In other areas of the country, you'll see reporting of lead contamination because of lead service lines or other issues with source water. And we haven't seen that as commonly in California, and we're actually able to solve a majority of the exceedances just by replacing the fixture. So that's the second part of this that's so exciting, is when they take that outlet out of service, OWP has a reimbursement program for them to replace the outlet or that fixture, and then we retest for free. They're allowed up to $450 per fixture, and that seems to be about the sweet spot. Usually costs come in a little bit lower. Sometimes they are right up against that cap. And if it seems a little high when you are walking down the big box store aisle looking at fixtures, just keep in mind that it does cost a bit to have a licensed plumber show up on site. And so it covers the cost of both the invoice from that plumber and the material cost. So that's really exciting. Again, a tested facility is a safe facility. And then if they choose to remediate by fixture replacement, we contribute to that, and worked out just a really efficient program with our campus and getting those checks out the door. And that's in large part, again, to our computer science intern team that has automated a lot of these processes just to do a check request. So it makes it really easy for us to manage that. Let's see. It's interesting, just kind of a preliminary results on an individual outlet. About 1 in 12 exceed that bottled water standard. So, you know, it's a number worth talking about. And so, you know, when you're looking at this many childcare centers tested, and usually it's averages about 7 or 8 outlets per childcare center on average, then you get a sense of the impact of this program and how many children we are protecting just by this testing program, and then further restoring that water via the remediation. All right, Maureen, I'm ready for the next slide. So just a couple minutes here on PFAS testing. Brand new program. This has just been released as a State Water Board order through Division of Drinking Water, which is also, by the way, a partner on the lead testing. So I should have mentioned that, and getting just excellent support with State Water Board on both of these programs. And in this case, again, this is a requirement coming out of statute, and then regulation via a board order to disadvantaged communities. And there's funding associated with it, and that's where we get involved to collect the sample. So what better place to focus on this testing program than disadvantaged communities? So that was the decision. And let's see, next slide. Okay, I mentioned funding by State Water Board. Maureen, you're going to love me for this, but I animated this a little bit. And so I need these slides, these bullets, because I have to remind myself, we all don't know what PFAS are. It's been in the news lately, but it's not spelled out. So, and yes, I'm going to read this. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, are fluorinated organic compounds containing at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom. That is your chemistry lesson for the day. If you didn't know it, don't feel bad. I had to read it too. There are over 12,000 variations or molecules that would be classified as PFAS. And part of this study is to figure out what are the appropriate test methods and to regulate that long term. The order itself is State Water Board Order 240002. And as I mentioned, that regulates all of the wells that serve our disadvantaged, and that S stands for severely disadvantaged communities. Next click. And they're all eligible for free testing. And there's an option to self-test. It's a bit of a different procedure, and there's a particular lab that needs to be used. So we really encourage people to use the free services. Next click. Okay, and next click, Maureen. All right, and just a review of the services that we're providing. Again, it's outreach. It's a public-facing dashboard that gives an overview of where we're at and testing all the wells in the program. There's 3,800 wells, plus or minus. It's affecting 1,207 water systems, plus or minus. And so, just a really big impact. Might be my newest favoritist project. We'll see. We're just starting, and we're just registering public water systems just starting this month. We're also subcontracting to a sampling team, so not just the data management side and the notification side for public water systems. We're subcontracting to the folks that are going to be showing up to collect those samples. And next click. And good, I got that in there. We went through a RFP process, went out to over 500 companies, and we had so many great proposals. I was so impressed with the process of using the RFP to identify an appropriate partner to this project. And we got so much good feedback as part of that process from many different companies. So it just really sharpened the entire project. And we landed with Geosentech, and we're really happy to have them on board and assisting. And they're really also not just for pulling samples, but they're also a leader in PFAS monitoring and laboratory analysis. All right, next click. Okay, so here's the same map we looked at for childcare centers. And you can see, and this is the LA area again, or Inland Empire. And you can see that it's just all over. So as we broaden this map out, you can see just Central Valley, both sides of the Sierra Nevada going up into Modoc County. So there isn't a county that isn't touched as far as I know. And again, over 1,200 water systems being served. And the order requires the testing to be completed August 2026. I think I have that right. The 2026 is definitely correct. And so we have a couple of years to get this done. Oh, and then the work is actually being done by Babcock, the laboratory analysis by Babcock Labs in Riverside, which is actually on this map, I'm sure, somewhere. Okay, that is our review of the PFAS project. It's going to be really interesting to have that level of PFAS. It's once through sampling, by the way, but it's going to be really nice to have a data point for groundwater essentially covering the entire state. And so if you know of a water system in a disadvantaged community, serving a disadvantaged community, yes, encourage them to register and also encourage them to use the free testing services. We're anxious to provide a high level of service to those systems. And here's our website for that program. All right, that's all the remarks I had on that, Maureen.
Thanks, Brian. Kevin, I'll turn it over to you. That's our show for today, and we're happy to take any questions.
All right. Great. And we have plenty of time for questions. So if you still want to submit a question, please submit them to the email address provided on the chat line. It's the seminar questions at owp.csus.edu. So a few questions have come in. Let's see. Let's see, Brian, and you might have touched on this a little bit. For the lead testing program, why is it focused on child care facilities? And two, can you speak of the biggest challenges of getting childcare facilities to take part in the lead testing program?
Well, the reason it's focused is because it is in statute. So that came directly from the legislature. I'll just go out on a limb for a second and surmise that when we're looking at being protective of children's health and minimizing the exposure of lead, we're looking at several different pathways of lead, and lead from paint chips, lead in the air we breathe, lead in food, which is coming more and more to the surface as we hear reports even in the last few weeks of lead in cinnamon products and dark chocolate. And so water is one of those pathways, as we know that's been in the news. And so when we look at those pathways, we also look for consistent exposure. And so certainly children are more vulnerable to lead poisoning. And so then we also look at where they exist most of the time, and they spend a substantial amount of time at a childcare facility. So I think that stands to reason. There's probably an element of where the state can regulate, and so I imagine that's part of why the legislature identified childcare centers here. Let's see, the second question, I think, is the challenge for participation. This is just my feeling on it. It's not like we have data, but we have these anecdotal experiences when we do talk to a childcare center. And again, this project launched during COVID. A lot of these centers were shut down and they're then coming back online, and they're dealing with layers of other regulation. This is just but one little element that they need to require for running a childcare center. So I think part of it is just the attention, the bandwidth of the childcare center operator. It's a small business. They're worried about the day-to-day safety of kids, getting them on and off campus. And so I think those challenges come to mind. We recently started doing some limited door-to-door outreach of centers that had not yet tested, and with extremely positive reaction. So it's not that they were unwilling. I think just Maureen mentioned hand-holding earlier. Who doesn't appreciate just being guided through a process a little bit? We try to make that process easy, but the word process itself is a little daunting. And so when we reach out and we just offer to help them through an eligibility form or online application, that goes a long way. So I think maybe even just being a little intimidated on the topic is part of it as well.
Yeah, Brian, and with the work with EPA, a lot of folks are using the term phone a friend, which is really what I like to think about. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I think the next question is for you, Maureen. This is from Jessa Rega. Did the YMCA camp get a grant? If so, could you please comment on which type? I was looking into grants for another YMCA camp.
The application has not been submitted yet. We're still working on but it will go through the SAFER program and funds from the state SRF program. So again, the application hasn't been submitted. We're still working out some treatment design pieces. If you are interested, we should have, Kevin, maybe I can pull up and throw in the chat the water board's TA request form. So if you're interested in something like that, you can fill out, again, 1 to 2 pages TA request form. I'm happy to talk with you if you want to shoot me an email and get you set up there.
Yeah, Jess, I'll reply to this email with that link. I have your email address, I believe. But But yeah, there is a technical assistance request form that you can fill out. Let's see, there's a question for Brian, John Johnston. For lead, there is a remediation component to the program. Is there one for PFAS as well?
Not, oh, great question. Not through our grant. However, I am happy to share that Division of Drinking Water has said that PFAS is going to be eligible for other funding sources. I think they're talking about SAFER, but it will be eligible for other sources of assistance.
All right, Brian, another question from Zoe over at the Civil Engineering Department. Will the PFAS data be available to public?
Hi, Zoe. Yes, it will, and that's through the Division of Drinking Water. And so, yeah, it's all of the samples collected going to a single lab, and that'll be vetted by DDW, as we say, and it will become public as all drinking water data is.
All right, and this is a question from Julian Fulton. Which definition of water system is used for the PFAS testing service? Are households or systems with fewer than 15 connections eligible?
Ooh, where did they draw the line? Julian, good question. I'll have to get back to you on that. Maureen, do you have any insight on the DAC list?
Not for, I think he's talking about a community water system versus domestic wells, you know, which
Yeah,
are,
but
are
yeah,
small systems. So, but I don't
yeah,
know the answer.
yeah. I need to learn the answer. But practically, Julian, there is an attachment on the board order that tells us exactly the affected water systems. So if there's a question that a water system has on why they are on or off the list, we defer those questions to the district engineer with Division of Drinking Water to handle those inquiries. Because yeah, if there's a threshold of, where the 15 connections, there, for some reason, I think it might be even lower of what designates public versus private, as Maureen was saying. Yeah, then we say, okay, well, sure. If you have more or less connections, go talk to the district engineer. And we're being flexible on our side to handle those additions and subtractions. So yeah, on last count, it's 1,207 water systems. But we know that there's going to be some rare adjustments to that number. You got me, Julian. That's a good one.
All right, there are no more questions. So on behalf of OWP and all today's participants, thank you, Brian and Maureen, for your presentation. And again, I also want to thank all our listeners, and I hope everybody has a great weekend. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.